In this online tutorial I'm going to show you how to make this amazing Bolero jacket, which is much easier than you think. First of all, we want to sew together the facing from the back onto the back lining. I'm pushing the fabric towards the presser foot. That lifts the pin up so I can pull it out easily. It makes you much faster. I'm now attaching the lower facing. And it's ready for ironing. But before we do that, you can put in a label. Now my label is of course Frocks Frolics, Flower Girls, so I'm putting my Frocks Frolics label in. Next we're going to interline our Bolero fronts. Stitch all the way around using a really large stitch, the largest you can get on your sewing machine, about 0.4 from the edge, so quite close because this doesn't need to show at all. Also, always have the stiffer fabric, in this case the calico, lying on top. It makes sewing easier and you will not have any pleats underneath it. Now we're going to close the sleeves. Important is that you have a pair. When you iron the seams, please iron the shell in one direction and the lining in the other, so that when you put them together it's nice and flat. There's no need to iron them all apart. Making a ruler loop is a fantastic skill to have. We're going to make all the ruler loops for the dress and the Bolero. Just change the presser foot to your piping foot. Move the needle all the way over to the left. Insert your piping cord into the cut bias binding and stitch along as far as you can over to the piping cord. Just make sure you don't stitch into it. Now remove the piping cord and cut back the seam allowance. Don't do it too short, about 3 millimeters is probably right, or even 4 depending on the thickness of the fabric. This is a fabric turner. It's a fantastic gadget which helps you turn these tiny little ruler loops over. It's got a little hook in the top, so hook that in, push the fabric over, and voila, you've got this wonderful ruler loop. I would suggest that you cut it now into the right size. 3.5 to 4 centimeters is about right for what you want to do, depending on the seam allowance that you have. If it's 1.5, please do make them 4 or even 4.5 centimeters long. And we're already closing the side seams. You've noticed that the color has changed. That's because when I did it originally, I actually forgot to press record on my pink one, so I had another order and I quickly filmed the parts that I was missing. So it's the same jacket, the same style, it just changed color. Iron the seams so that you've got the lining going one direction and the shell going the other. Next we're going to attach the ruler loop. It's important that the seam shows and faces upwards so that when you turn it all around the seam actually doesn't show. Now we're going to attach the lining to the shell fabric. Pin it all the way around the outer edge from the start of the neck hole, and when it's nice and flat we're just sewing around there where you can see my fingers point, nowhere else. Have the needle down when you turn the fabric and ease the fabric in. It probably is easier to actually sew it from the other side, which has the calico facing up. I just made the conscious choice to do it from this side, but you can see how I have to ease the fabric in. It would be easier if the calico was facing upwards on the fronts. Now we're going to cut the seam allowances back as ever, because when you turn it inside out you of course don't want a huge amount of fabric in the way. Also snip all the curves to allow for the movement so there's no pulling. cut back seam allowances. Again, the aim is always to have everything nice and flat. Now I'm going to show you how to stitch back a seam allowance. It's probably one of the most important skills as a dressmaker that you should have. And when you see a lot of home dressmakers, so it looks a bit puffy. Now this is how to avoid it. Take the seam allowance and fold it into the facing or the lining. Then stitch about 1 or 2 millimeters away from your seam, and you will attach it down onto the lining. Now what that does, it creates a really firm edge, and also of course it holds the lining in place. It ensures that it can't roll out and show. And you can already see that the fabric automatically knows where it needs to go. It's brilliant. Now I'm doing it all the way around, always checking that my seam allowances are towards the lining, are towards the facing, and I push the fabric apart, pull it apart, sorry. It's just fantastic. I think it's one of the best skills I have learned when I was a tailor's apprentice. It does take a bit of practice, but once you're there, you'll do it with most things, because it makes your ironing so much easier. You don't have to take a pin and pull things out forever and then, you know, iron a bit, put the iron down, use your pin again. So when we're looking at it in a minute, you will see how flat it already lies, and it hasn't been ironed at all. There you go. It's just a matter of easing it out, pushing your hands over it, and your job's done. It's a fabulous technique. Of course, I do need to sew it now. I do need to iron it. But what it also does is, as you can see, that now the lining shows a little bit, and we don't want that. So what I'll do is I pin it into place, and I will remove this excess fabric. This technique you can use on a lot of different items. As you go through my projects and they pop up on YouTube, you will see that I always use the same techniques, because they're so easy. And so remove my pins, and we're now closing the neckline. Now sew the neckline, and then you do the usual steps, which is cutting back the seam allowance to make sure that we haven't got too much fabric there and it gets in the way. We are snipping in all the curves, and lastly, of course, we are stitching back that seam allowance. And you should remember now that we're moving the seam allowance towards the lining, towards the facing, pulling the fabric apart, and then slowly moving it through the sewing machine. You can see that I don't pin these things. Actually, I find that pins just get in the way for some things. Obviously there are things you have to pin, but don't overpin things, and try to do it without. In fact, it's easier. Now we have to close the shoulder seams. So place them on top of each other. Grab the outside, there we go, and then pin it all the way across. So instead of closing shoulder seams and then doing the front and the neckline in one go, we're actually doing the shoulder seams last. And you can do it all in one. Very easy. I think when you're sewing, that's what it's all about, finding the steps that are easy and that will allow you to get a really professional finish. Iron those seams apart, and even without ironing it already looks flat. Now we're going to prepare our sleeves, and we're back to the pink. You need a large stitch again, and then you go all the way around the edges. Now again, I find I don't have to pin that, the pins get in the way. If you're working really accurately, you don't have to spend all that time pinning. Do the bottom as well, so the lining is held in place. For the sleeve you don't need an interlining, simply because otherwise it'll get far too thick. Now there are 2 snips at the bottom of that sleeve, and that's where we are going to insert some gathers. Put your gather stitch in, one almost next, well, a few millimeters next to the edge, and then foot width next to that. You lock the thread in at the beginning, but not at the end, and then you pull the top threads. Pull as hard as you can. It'll come to about 2–2.5 centimeters, I should imagine. And that's exactly the right width. If you're working with my pattern, it'll just be perfect. Now next you want to use a bit of bias binding. Always work from the inside and attach it. I'm attaching it with maybe a 3mm seam, so that means my bias binding is actually not lining up with the edge of the sleeve, but a little bit further over, just to make sure that I don't miss any. Now I can cut back my seam allowance, and over that seam allowance I will roll my bias binding to the outside and pin it into place. The next step is to turn that little sleeve inside out. That makes it easier to sew, because otherwise you couldn't really do it. It's a bit too slim to put it under any other way. And you're stitching as close as you can now to the edge, and again I wouldn't pin it if you can avoid it. You'll be better without it because you can use your fingers. The closer you go to the edge, the nicer it will look, and you'll get a fantastic professional finish. Now we're going to insert the sleeves. I've already, and you're rolling the fabric over your hands to the outside. There has to be a little bit of ease in there, otherwise the sleeve will be tight. Now make sure that the gathers are really well spread at the top. You want about 5.5 centimeters to the front from the shoulder seam, and about 4 to the back. That's what looks quite good for a little one like that. If you're doing an adult one, it'll be significantly more. I would suggest that you make the seam slightly wider, sort of 1.2 or even 1.3. If you're working with one of the commercial patterns from a shop, of course, it'll be 1.5. And all that remains to be done with that really is to now neaten the edge. First of all though, I touch my button. You can look on how to make the dress to learn how to cover a button. Now this is a really quick way to create a knot. You just wiggle it around the needle and hold it and pull it through. When you sew on the top button, go all the way through the fabric. Children are quite active, and you don't want the fabric to rip just because somebody held onto that bolero and gave that kid a good pull. So there, the jacket is almost finished. Now next I'm going to overlock it. Now I've got an industrial machine here, but of course you can do that on a domestic overlocker, or you can zigzag it. Or even better, if you are feeling like the bias binding is your cup of tea, bind it. The good thing about these boleros is they're easy to make, they're very fast, they take little fabric, and they always look the part. I hope you enjoyed Sewing with a Pro.